China's plans for the coming year have been set out at its National People's Congress. The fortunes of the planet's second largest economy are now of global interest, as are its political intentions. So what's in store for China and for the rest of the world? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Jonah. There was a time when the world saw the business of the Chinese Communist Party as largely a domestic matter, hardline and apparently secretive politics in a country essentially closed off to the rest of the world. But not anymore. China's transformation into an economic and technological powerhouse is, in a globalised world, means that what goes on there is keenly watched by political leaders and businesses everywhere. Both East and West need each other economically, but trade between the two now takes place in a much more volatile geopolitical climate. Some of that's due to more confrontational relations between China and the US, and a few upsets in the country's economy, notably in real estate, have worried some investors. All was on the agenda at the National People's Congress annual gathering, with 3,000 delegates meeting over a week to set out China's priorities for the coming year. So what are they? And what do they mean for China and for the rest of the world? We'll be asking our guests those questions and more in just a few moments. But first, Imogen Kimber reports on what was discussed at the Congress.
China's economy is slowing, but the government is aiming for 5% growth in 2024. That's the focus of this annual meeting of the National People's Congress. Under discussion, developing new technologies, from electric vehicles to AI, like the facial recognition scanners lining the entrance to the conference. Another front where China seeks to catch up with the US. Attracting foreign investment and business is a key aim, but some international companies find China's regulations unappealing.
It's necessary to introduce more targeted measures to facilitate trade. The General Administration of Customs will take the lead in organising special campaigns to facilitate cross-border trade, offer more convenience to authorised economic operator enterprises, and to continue to expand the pilot programmes for cross-border e-commerce.
The domestic housing market is among the challenges China faces to achieving more economic growth. In 2021, the market burst as construction giant Evergrande ran out of money, leaving an estimated millions of people without homes they'd already paid for. The government says action is being taken.
Real estate enterprises that are severely insolvent and have lost their ability to operate should follow the principles of the rule of law and marketization and undergo bankruptcy and restructuring. Behavior that harms the interests of the masses will be investigated and punished.
Youth unemployment is at a record high of nearly 15%, and tensions are rising in the South China Sea. For the countries worried about an increase in military activity in the Pacific and increased hostilities between the US and China, the 7.2% rise in defence spending will be a concern. China spends nearly $300 billion a year on defence, a third of the $900 billion spent by the United States, a fact that worries Beijing.
We urge the United States, Britain and Australia to abandon the Cold War mentality and to faithfully fulfill international obligations and to stop creating greater trouble for regional peace and stability.
China is the world's second largest economy and an emerging superpower, and its drive for greater growth is being closely watched by global competitors. Imogen Kimber, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Let's bring in our guests now in Beijing. Einar Tangen is a senior fellow at the Taihe Institute in Jakarta. Bert Hofman is a professor at the East Asian Institute of National University of Singapore. He was also with the World Bank in China for 12 years, 6 of them as country director. And in London, Vicky Pryce is chief economic advisor at the Centre for Economics and Business Research and a former UK government economic advisor. Welcome to you all. So there was no customary press conference following this year's Congress by Premier Li Qiang that would have helped us read the runes and try to understand China's challenges and China's future direction. So, Einar, let me come first of all to you. And I wonder, first of all, whether the absence of a press conference was, in fact, a way of avoiding scrutiny over the collapse of the massive housing market and also talk around the 5% growth figure posted, which some people for this year, which some people find ambitious. So do you think that the government would rather not be talking about real estate? And do you think that 5% GDP growth is realistic?
Well, let me answer those in reverse order. I do think if they say 5%, they've been pretty good about hitting their targets. In terms of discussing real estate, they discussed it at great length, as you know, our discussion hopefully will show. In terms of why he didn't do the press conference, I'm going to assume that it was personal. They had other people talking. I think from his perspective, if you look at his track record, he's more interested in results. He does a tremendous number of inspections, work meetings, very, very practical and very, very much centered on the domestic economy. His predecessor used to dabble in the international side a lot more. But, you know, I think people are trying to read a little bit too much into this, that somehow he's afraid of the press or something. Remember, these are not politicians in the way that the U.S. or Europe or Great Britain has. They simply are people who are professionals, are responsible for getting it done. His real judgment will come up next year when there's another work report and he's either accomplished what he said he was going to do or hasn't.
OK, so nothing to hide there. Other people have done the talking. The numbers do the talking, or at least some of them as well. Bert Hofman, I want to read a rather interesting, fascinating, really, statistic. I thank the New York Times for this one. China's central bank lending to real estate was $800 billion in 2019. 4 years later, it had fallen to just $75 billion in 2023. Lending to industry, meanwhile, that was $83 billion in 2019. Has soared to $670 billion in 2023, a remarkable change of direction for an economy in just 4 years, including the pandemic years, and an illustration, really, of the ability of the Chinese economic system to change.
Well, clearly, this is a major reallocation of resources, of banking resources, not the central bank, but the banking system. And it started with a correction under real estate development in 2020, the end of 2020, when the three red line policy came in, which basically discouraged lending to real estate, which the leadership felt was starting to become too risky, too much of a bubble. And so now there is a reallocation to the future direction of development, and that is in manufacturing, according to the leadership. So you have the banking system that pretty much follows that. It has issues with it. It's great that to some extent there's less real estate being constructed, but of course we've already seen a lot of the fallout from that, including buildings not finished and people waiting for the housing. Lots of bankruptcies are probably going to follow. But at the same time, the manufacturing sector is doing quite well. The one thing that they don't do is absorb a lot of jobs. And I think that's going to be one of the key constraints for the leadership going forward.
Vicky Pryce, perhaps consequent to this rise in manufacturing, Chinese officials at the NPC complaining about a perceived wave of unfair protectionism being levelled at China from around the world, citing an IMF report that said that trade restrictions around the world have tripled in the past 4 years, much of it aimed at China. So is the world ganging up on China?
It's true that the trade environment has become more difficult. In fact, it's become more difficult for loads of countries, and we are perhaps moving into a sort of deglobalization phase. It also explains why China is now looking to focus much more in developing its domestic economy and perhaps relying a little bit less on exports. And if you look at what has been going on in the last year, the value of exports of goods from China went down. And that, of course, is quite important for a country that has traditionally relied on exporting to the rest of the world. And also the destination of those exports has changed quite significantly. So not so much to the US, because of course there are all these sanctions, there were restrictions there as well, but also redirecting exports to other parts of the world. So there has been a switch, there is no doubt about it. And I think the plans we're hearing about this year and also for later for China do suggest that this reorientation is what they're going to be focusing on. But exports have been very, very significant for growth. If you look at what's been going on, and the 5% growth that we may get this year is a lot less than what used to be the case in the past. And that is really because of the fact, A, that China has become a more mature economy and it can't grow quite so fast as it did before, but also because on the export side, and therefore manufacturing in particular, it needs to rethink what it does. Also, actually, in terms of the loans to businesses that you referred to earlier, there's been a big drive to improve technology innovation and compete a lot more with the US and others, particularly given the fact that there are export or rather import restrictions for China coming from goods from the US.
Right. Well, I mean, you alluded there to changing geopolitical alliances and shifting sands. We will talk about those in a minute. But perhaps, as you mentioned, one way of addressing this issue of the domestic economy, jobs and so on, is, Bert, this is to you, a drive towards, and it was talked about at the Congress, so-called future industries. We're talking about everything from electric cars to surveillance technology, facial recognition, artificial intelligence, even commercial space flight. How big a transition is this for the Chinese economy? How effective is it likely to be? And how big a risk does it pose to the likes of Silicon Valley and the big electric car makers of Japan and South Korea and others?
So it is a very serious switch, and clearly the new drivers of growth or the future industries are being built as we speak, and there's a lot of resources from the banking system, from the government, and from businesses themselves being allocated to new technologies. Spending on research and development now in China is higher than in the EU at 2.6% of total GDP. And that, of course, already results into competitive industries and the electric vehicles, the solar, the new energy, that China is already very competitive. And it starts to show up in domestically, but also internationally. Then there's a second category, which is the future industries. And that is more sort of the cutting edge. So still, it's not yet ripe for production, but China is investing in it. It's bringing in the science, it's bringing in the technology, so that in future they would actually dominate. So they're moving from absorbing technologies that are already there from abroad to trying to create the new technologies that would determine in 5 or 10 years the future industrial landscape. That's a big move.
And Vicky, I see you nodding along there. I mean, Western markets see this coming, don't they? Particularly in the sphere of, say, electric vehicles, where the EU is looking at putting tariffs onto Chinese imports in those markets and others. And
yes, there is a bit of a concern, of course, that quite a lot of the support that has been given to industry in China really means subsidies, and that goods are being exported, particularly electric vehicles, at prices which other countries cannot compete against. And the share, of course, of EVs from China has increased very substantially in the world market. And I think those are the issues that everyone has to battle with. And we've seen right now what's going on in the EU, where there is a lot of re-emphasizing the growth in the green industries, and also, of course, what happens in the US with the Inflation Reduction Act, where they are subsidizing a lot of the green production, if you want to call it that, for EVs and other manufacturing areas if you're building them in the US. But actually, we have seen China also investing internationally a lot more, Chinese companies getting into the market and also up to a point getting around some of those rules. And I think that's an interesting part of what's been going on recently.
Vicky, Einar says no. Einar, what do you think of that?
Well, Vicky, I mean, for many people, it seems hypocritical. I mean, Europe and America have been preaching, the importance of the market, how you have to trust in it. And as soon as China actually does something, all of a sudden it's, you're getting too far ahead. It's now time to put up the walls. The fact is, 12 years ago, everyone was laughing at China because they said they're going to put a serious, pitch in for EVs. Why? Because they had real problems in the cities with exhaust gases. People were complaining about the quality of air, things like that. Now, Beijing is quite nice. I live here, so I noticed the difference. So China has been initially, they tried to bring this industry along, but right now it's the subject of extremely brutal competition. A lot of these companies are losing money. They are not being subsidized by the government. Quite the contrary, it's the U.S., Europe that are looking to subsidize their industries simply because they did not keep up. So this idea that somehow it's okay when we win, but not okay when anyone else wins.
Right.
Not only for China, but for a lot of the global South, they see this as the same kind of hypocritical thinking that's been going on for way too long.
I know. I just want to touch on another aspect of these sort of future industries. Artificial intelligence, a huge future global market. Of course, China looking to make headroads there and gain a competitive edge, it is suggested, by treating AI development with a sort of light touch regulation. Now, lots of people are already very nervous about the potential effects and consequences of AI. Should we be worried about the sort of AI that comes out of China?
Well, we should be worried about any kind of AI. If you read the Snowden dossier and what he spilled, I mean, AI is obviously going to be used by governments all around the world in order to do whatever it is they think they need to do to, quote, protect themselves for security reasons, regardless of the implications for privacy. China is not alone, but they have a sense that AI does have dangers. Back in 2013, they started this idea of a sovereign internet, the idea that countries are responsible for what is generated in their country in terms of information and also what is coming in. They need to protect their people from malign influences. So China is pursuing that. We'll see what happens. China has a big advantage is data. It is not at the forefront of AI at this juncture. But as we've seen in the past, underestimating what the Chinese can do, you do at your own peril.
OK, Einar, I'm going to stay with you. Stay with us, Bert and Vicky. But I want to move on to defence now. Defence spending set at 7.2% for 2024. That's a repeat of 2023. China putting a lot of money into defence, clearly. At the same time, something interesting came out of the Congress, which was a very subtle change in language in the Premier's work report. Last year, it referred to a peaceful moves towards Chinese reunification. I'm talking about Taiwan, of course. This year, the word peaceful doesn't feature. We're talking about a firm advance towards reunification. Should we, in conjunction with defence spending hikes, see a shift in tone as a shift in strategy towards Taiwan?
No, I don't think so. I mean, if you look at the last 6 years, I mean, there were years when it was as high as 8.6. The 7.2, as you pointed out, is the same as last year, and it's at the median level. In terms of Taiwan, as you know, there was a report today that came out that said that U.S. Special Forces are now permanently going to be in Taiwan, training the Taiwanese to resist. The U.S. is providing very, very high grade, not only defense, but also weapons that we can use on the offense. U.S. is sailing ships up and down the Taiwan Straits. China is trying to draw this red line. They've done it consistently. Do not interfere with the one China policy. So from Beijing's point of view, they keeps trying to send the message. Unfortunately, Washington isn't receiving it, apparently.
Well, what Washington is doing, along with the likes of Japan, Australia and South Korea, Bert, let me put this to you, is also hiking their defence spending, not exclusively, but partly because of a perceived threat from China, whilst China moves closer towards the likes of Russia, Iran, North Korea, those three countries all getting warm words at the Congress. Is China effectively now, do you think, at the centre of a new arms race, Bert?
Well, clearly China's might, because of its economic might, is growing in the region, and that makes some countries nervous. China has also been more active in the region, including in the South China Sea. which they say is their sovereign territory, and many would dispute it because they think it is their sovereign territory and their exclusive economic zones. So that does stir up something. Just on the defense spending, the 7.2% would be exactly in line with nominal GDP. So as a share of GDP, if the targets come out, China's defense spending would not increase. So let's not think that this is a very big increase. No, it's not. It's 5% GDP growth plus 3%, what the Chinese think, 3% inflation. So it's not growing in share of GDP.
Moving swiftly along, foreign policy now, also discussed very significantly at the Congress. We did get a press conference with Foreign Minister Wang Yi, giving us some idea of how China sees its place in the world. Improved relations with the United States following that meeting between Xi Jinping and Joe Biden in San Francisco last year, but also markedly improved relations, as I said, with the likes of Russia, Iran and North Korea. Einar, does China think that it can, or should it be able to expect that it can have it both ways? Good relations with the United States and the West, and also good relations with countries that the West, many countries in the West, view as enemies?
Well, China's, if you take China and the U.S., China's the only one who's saying that they want to improve relations. But Wang Yi, in the second part of his speech, as you recall, has said, look, the U.S. talks one thing and does another. That kind of inconsistency makes it very difficult to pursue a relationship. China's basically in the position of the prisoner's dilemma. It's the U.S. is far more powerful economically, politically, and militarily, and is intent on keeping China down. That's Beijing's view. And if you look at the evidence, you know, everything that the U.S. is doing, from keeping chips going, it seems that that would be, in fact, the impression anyone would get in a reasonable thing. So in terms of, you know, Iran and also Russia, I don't know that having friend relations they're not only having good relations with those countries, but as was testified by the 152 countries that showed up for the Belt and Road Initiative 10-year anniversary, China has good relations with practically everybody. So I you know, singling these out and saying, well, they have good relations with people we don't like, I don't think that is very fair. But one thing, you know, people keep talking about this peak China. I would ask people to consider something. The U.S. went to great lengths to keep Russia and Europe apart. The combination would have been very, very, you know, a real threat to U.S. dominance. And as we know, from the way that Japan was treated in the 70s, the U.S. does not play well with this idea of other dominant countries. So, but unfortunately, they created an even more stronger you know, competitor in terms of Russian resources, Chinese manufacturing. China's manufacturing right now stands at equal to the next 9 countries in terms of their manufacturing. Russia spans 13 time zones. They have untold resources available. So the combination is something that should be worrying Washington, not this idea that China is being friendly.
Bert, looking quizzically amused. Do you want to come in on that, Bert?
Well, look, for Europe, of course, the close relationship of China with Russia is a big concern because Russia has invaded another country. It has threaded on all of the principles that Europe stands for, the OSCE stands for, and the UN stands for. And that's, of course, where China is quite uncomfortable because they have been very much emphasizing the prime position of sovereignty. And this is here is one of the strategic partners that is invading another country. So that is really very difficult for China to handle, frankly. What it has done in Europe is to strengthen NATO, is to expand NATO with Finland and Sweden and maybe in future other countries. So it's you know, it's a very messy situation, and it's of course not good for the world economy. It's not good for the world, and but the prime reason was a Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Vicky, help us draw the conversation to a close. China embarked on a sort of sense of economic and strategic realignment. There are obvious divides, differences and areas of mistrust. But, you know, this is the world's second largest economy. The economies of the West can't avoid doing business with China. They can't afford to.
It is true, but of course what's going on between China and Russia has meant that it has allowed Russia to sort of collect enough revenues to continue spending on ammunitions and its own defense spending. So that's always a worry, obviously, for the West. But it's absolutely true that China is still a very, very important trading partner for loads and loads of countries, and therefore diplomatic relations are very important, foreign relations are important. But the interesting thing also is that China has been quite important, if you like, in setting the pricing of goods internationally. So for the last few months, almost for the last year, really, or for the last 6 months, certainly since the middle of the summer, China has been exporting deflation to the rest of the world. And if you look at this inflation profile, yes, there was a little bit of an uptick in February, but until then, we were seeing either no change inflation or negative inflation, so deflation within the country, producer prices going down. That has been reflected in quite a lot of what's going on internationally as well. And I think you just see quite a lot of the reduction that we've seen in goods prices across in inflation across the world stemming from what's going on in China. I'm mentioning that just as an example of the importance still of China as a huge trading partner, whatever that reorientation, if you like, of economic activities may have been in the last few months.
I know. Last word to you. Do you accept that China is exporting deflation to the world?
Well, I think the world is wants deflation. I think that was my colleague's point. But I want to get back to something Bert said. I mean, let's see what happens if Donald Trump is president, whether or not that affects NATO, since it seems like he's intent on getting out of it. So I don't know that NATO has become stronger because it's involved in wars, especially in Russia, and what preceded the conflict in Ukraine.
Okay. Well, I think we're going to leave our discussion there. My thanks to all of my guests, Einar Tangen, to Bert Hofman, and of course Vicky Pryce. And thanks to you for watching. You can see the programme anytime, again, by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Jonah Hull, and the whole team here. Goodbye for now.